Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Glad you could join us today, and we have a new contributor that we'd like to introduce to you. His name is Mackenzie France. Mac, this is your first time on the show, so for those of us who are just getting acquainted with you, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Hi, Bryan. It's really nice to be here. My name is Mackenzie France, and I'm from the UK. I work at a think tank called the Pinsker Centre, and we specialise in foreign policy, specifically the Middle East. And we also educate students, take various trips to Israel. So a wide encompassing amount of things that we do, but mainly specialism in foreign policy.
Well, and we've got quite a topic here to cover. This is regarding free speech and anti-Semitism, and in particular, Meta, which many of us may remember as Facebook. Talk to me a little bit about some of the changes that are taking place with Meta, and then let's apply that to the problem of anti-Semitism.
Sure. So the actual changes that are being made aren't so clear as of yet. The suggestion that was made a few weeks ago was that Meta was going to move for their content moderation towards a X or Twitter-style community notes function, rather than having fact-checkers employed by Meta to sift through content or go through content when it's reported and decide, based on their interpretations, whether it is violating Meta's terms of service or not. Everyone should be familiar with community notes now if you're an X user, and that basically just allows a select few users who've gone through some processes to almost self-fact check posts that come up, and then whether the fact check is accepted or not is done by a community voting system. So that is the main proposed change that Meta are thinking about doing.
Now, I'm going to speak as a user of both, although I use Meta less than I used to, and I spend much more time on X. There is bad information that gets through from time to time on X, but I had the perception that it seems to be corrected very, very quickly. It's hard to slip something past the people who are able to add community notes. And it's not that everybody's laying in wait and, gotcha, so much as just simply bad information can be quickly corrected on the fly. And to me, that seems a much better approach than, nope, you're not allowed to say, this or that.
Yeah, I would agree, Brian. I think that if anyone who uses X knows that generally community notes are pretty quick. I mean, if you see something that is not true, you don't even have to be a community notes author yourself to flag it and suggest that there should be somebody checking this, which is sort of similar to the flagging system that Meta use already. And of course, you're right. Most community notes that come through are good fact checks of whatever information was being said. And also, you can't abuse the system because if you do repeatedly rate things, the way it's done is helpful or not helpful. And if you repeatedly rate things as helpful that are wrong or incorrect for whatever reason, your ability to write community notes is taken away. So, yeah, I think most X users would agree that not only is it difficult to get a community note that isn't true, but they're also pretty fast and responsive ways of correcting misinformation and disinformation.
So now let's apply this to the issue of anti-Semitism. And, I do see a degree of anti-Semitism, or at least anti-Semitic thought that appears on X. But how can we have, how can we effectively address anti-Semitism? And for that matter, I'm going to start, Mac, with why does it need to be addressed? What are we seeing that makes it an imperative that we address it?
Sure. So I think there's two separate issues there. Obviously, I'll start with the importance of addressing anti-Semitism at this specific moment. Obviously, since the Hamas terrorist attacks of October 7th, we have seen an absolute explosion of anti-Semitism, both online and in the real world. I think in my article, I cite the ADL's figure of a 360% increase, and that has happened across the world. Pretty much everybody reporting similar increases in numbers. So I suppose that the reason why it's so pressing now is because of the sheer explosion. And also, I think because the Israel-Palestine conflict has become much more prescient in people's minds, there is a lot of information and there's a lot of rhetoric out there that is straying into anti-Semitism, either intentionally or unintentionally, that wasn't there before. People are now talking about Israel and Palestine on the daily, and that is, as I describe in my article, a perfect smokescreen for anti-Semites who want to criticize Jews, through the proxy of Israel.
Okay, so I have to ask this. Is Israel above criticism?
Yeah, I mean, this is a common thing that's leveled at advocates against anti-Semitism or supporters of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And I just don't think it's true. The thing that I like to say to people who ask me this question is, what is it that you're afraid to say? Because, the Pinsker Center, where I work, we host vociferous debates about Israel, the nature of Zionism, the settlement of the conflict. And I never in a million years has it strayed into anti-Semitism. And with this specific article in question, the thing that I wanted to advocate for and make sure Meta got right is that in specific instances of calls for violence or glorification of terrorism, you can't hide behind a proxy term for Jews when what you actually mean is Jews. If you're saying that, if you're using Nazi tropes about rats or plagues or viruses, but you're substituting the word Zionist for Jew, your intention is pretty clear. And I'm not sure what legitimate criticism of Israel you're trying to make there. The policy issues and the nature of Israel's policy, how it deals with the conflict up and down, are all fair game. I enjoy talking about it, but there are some foundational issues, as expressed in the IHRA definition, which I don't think is too all-encompassing. I think it is pretty fair, that offer a good baseline. And I think especially we should start with calls for violence and glorification of terrorism as a good baseline.
Could we get a good working definition of what is meant by Zionist? Because it's a word, I've used it from time to time, in that there was a time I was very Zionist in my thinking, which to me was, I felt like really Israel could do no wrong, or that they were unfairly maligned, and that, the criticisms, leveled against, the establishment of the state of Israel, I just didn't know much about it. And I'm no longer Zionist in my thinking, meaning that I think there are some places where rightly their government should be criticized, but I'm not sure that how I'm using that term lines up with how you may be using it.
Sure. So at its very core, to be a Zionist is to believe that the state of Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. That is it. The only prescription is that you believe that Israel should exist as a Jewish state in the Middle East, the world's only Jewish state. You want to talk about criticism of the Israeli government? I've got plenty myself, especially some of the recent actions of the Israeli government and historic Israeli governments. But nowhere in the world, when you criticize a government, are you criticizing the right of that state to exist as is. And unfortunately, that is the case with Israel, which is why we have to pay special attention to it. I'm a huge critic of my own Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, but no one, I'm not calling for a dismantling of the United Kingdom. And I'm afraid that is the sort of cause that innocent criticism of Israel, quote unquote, often strays into.
Well, and thank you for the definition. The reason I ask for that is because sometimes it's very easy for a word like Zionist to become a very broad net to strain out people who may not really have, truly anti-Semitic, hateful antipathy toward Jews, but may have legit criticisms of the Israeli state and what its government is doing. And I know it's hard to make that distinction, but I feel like it still needs to be done, lest it's one of those things. Well, we can't talk about that, or people tend to shy away from it because they're afraid the ice I'm standing on may be very thin, rhetorically speaking.
Yeah, I think that it is totally valid to criticize the government of Israel, and in my day-to-day work, often I'm very critical of the government of Israel. But the point of my article and the point that I wanted to get across was that none of that criticism has to include calls for violence or calls for the eradication of Israel. You might be surprised hearing me say that anybody who believes that Israel should exist as a Jewish state is a Zionist. You might have people out there thinking, wow, maybe I'm a Zionist. And I hope that that's the case. And there is lots of healthy discussion we can have within that boundaries that doesn't stray into calling for dismantling Israel or calls for violence.
Hey, I applaud you for taking on what can only be described as a touchy subject and doing a great job of discussing it. We're talking with Mackenzie France. He is a Young Voices contributor. Where can people follow you on social media?
Follow me on X at Mackenzie_FR.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are joined by William Dunstan, joining us from Canada to talk about raising the age of pension eligibility. Welcome, William. Let's just dive right in, shall we?
We have a program called the Canada Pension Plan, or the CPP, which is a program where the benefits you receive in retirement are based on the contributions you make into the program throughout your working life. And those are obligatory contributions. It's funded through a payroll tax. So you have those two programs where the standard age of eligibility is 65. You can do a little bit of playing around to change the age where you actually take it, but the basic age is 65. Essentially, the problem is that Canada's demographics have changed considerably since the time these programs were introduced in their modern form in about the 1960s, but the programs themselves haven't really kept up. For the Canada Pension Plan, it has evolved a little bit as they have raised contribution rates to account for the fact that they're now needing to cover more people for longer, but old age security is essentially just increased spending without any changes. And what I mean by demographics changing is when these programs were introduced in the first place in the 60s, Canadians were living on average about 10 years post-retirement, and seniors were about 10% of the population. Today, it was about 15 years post-retirement, and they're 10 years, 10% of the population. Today, it's about 20 years people are living post-retirement, post the age of 65, and seniors are about 20% of the population. So what that means is that these programs are funding a lot more people for a lot longer, and that's creating a lot of fiscal challenges just in terms of overall spending, and then broader economic challenges caused by that increase in government spending and by having people out of the workforce longer than they need to be. So there's really a need in Canada to up that age of eligibility to at least 67, which many other countries have done, so that these programs are in the form that they were originally intended to be, and that'll save the government a lot of money.
It's an interesting conundrum. I mean, in the sense that we ought to be very happy that people are living longer. Obviously, quality of life has improved, and the fact that people are living longer should be something to celebrate. However, on the other side of that equation is, as you mentioned, more people that will require that support in their older age. Help me understand, you mentioned in your article that the funding for those programs is proportionally being carried by a smaller working age population. Why is that working age population shrinking?
So it's not that the working age population has shrunk in terms of total numbers. Canada's population is continuing to increase relatively rapidly. It's more that it's shrunk as a proportion. And that's really because of, like you were saying, people are living longer. You also right now have that baby boomer generation who are now the largest generation, who are now hitting the 65 to 85 range. So that just means you have a smaller, for every retiree, you now have fewer Canadians paying into those programs, which is a particular problem for a program like OAS, which is funded through general tax revenue. Because when you're paying into the program for more people for longer, but it's cheaper people paying in, it's that much more of a stress on government finances.
And I'm not asking you to solve the problem here, all in one neat, pat answer, but what are some of the possible solutions? I know that this is happening in other countries as well. I liken it to there are more people riding in the wagon than there are pulling the wagon, and it sounds like that number is increasing. What are some of the possible solutions that have been floated, besides, raising the retirement age, as you have mentioned?
Well, in terms of other solutions that have been floated, in terms of getting more people in the workforce and working more, that really is a challenge in Canada right now. One of our biggest public policy challenges in Canada is our poor rates of economic growth and productivity, particularly relative to the United States over the past 20 years. And that's part of why it's so important to raise the retirement age. So we're in a situation in Canada where our governments the federal government's running a substantial deficit. Most provinces are running deficits. And we have a number of growing spending priorities. You have a population that's getting older. That means you have to spend more on healthcare. You have to spend more on seniors' benefits unless you reform them. We're probably going to need to up spending on defense. And at the same time, we have relatively limited ability to raise tax revenues. And that's a fact, regardless of whether you have a small government or big government perspective. We're struggling to bring investment into the country, so it's not really an environment where you can do much to raise taxes. So if you want to get more investment into the country, you need to be looking at, deregulation, lowering taxes. And in order to fund, the reduction of taxes, you need to come up with some amount of spending cuts at the federal level and really not even cut in seniors' benefits, just getting them back to what they were originally intended to be is the most viable way to do that. I think you're having a similar conversation in the U.S. with DOGE about how are we actually going to cut a lot of government spending. And you'll often hear people saying things like, well, we should cut foreign aid. In Canada, people want to cut the public broadcaster. And those are valid points, but they're really not a big share of government spending. The really big shares of government spending are healthcare, education, defense, transfers to individuals like seniors' benefits. So really getting the age of eligibility for these programs higher or reducing their payout for higher income individuals. Those are really the least painful ways you can cut public spending in Canada and get government finances and our economy back on track.
So I'm curious how they arrive at the number, raising the number or the age of retirement. It seems like a very small thing, a couple of years. But what kind of a difference does it make to have 2 more years without having those individuals on the retirement system?
Yeah, so in Canada, we actually have a pretty good estimate of that because back in 2012, the previous Conservative government, so the government before Justin Trudeau's administration, was looking at doing that, increasing the age of OAS to 67. And they found it would save the government about $10 billion every single year, which is a sizable chunk of government spending, especially in a country like Canada that's much smaller than the United States. So that's how much you would have saved back then. It's probably an even bigger number now because you've had, over those past 10, 15 years, even more growth in the seniors population.
And is it as tough a sell in Canada as it has been elsewhere? I mean, you mentioned in your article, the U.S. is moving to 67. I don't hang with the close to retirement age people just yet. I'm getting close, but the UK has raised theirs to 68. Does that cause anxiety for those people who are nearing retirement age to have to put that off for another couple of years?
Yeah, it's definitely something that's caused anxiety, and that's why you saw when the Conservative government put in an initial plan to do this, the Trudeau government chose to reverse it. But like you mentioned, lots of other countries have managed to make these reforms work. So it's definitely politically challenging, but it's not impossible. And that's why I think now is where I think we're in Canada going to be in a more conducive political environment for governments to make these tough decisions and make the spending cuts they need to make. Whether you think any sort of government spending is wasteful or not, there's always someone who's benefiting from it and someone who's going to lose out if you make cuts. And I think what we're seeing in Canada right now, where we have pressures on government spending, we're already struggling with productivity. We have a trade war with the U.S. that may or may not be going ahead. That's going to cause even more economic problems. I think Canadians are going to start to realize there really is a need to make those tough choices about our economy and about government spending. And I think in that environment, it'll be easier for politicians to make the case that really getting the age of eligibility of OAS and CPP up is going to be one of the least painful ways we can get government spending back under control.
Well, and politicians, I'm not trying to throw them all under the bus, but they're very good at portraying any kind of a spending cut as, there could be 90% waste or bloated government spending, but they'll point to, but this puppy will die if you don't, if that funding doesn't stay exactly where it is. And typically that's where people's, attention and emotional attachment is going to go. So I don't envy those politicians who have to make those decisions, but I also feel for the taxpayers because, let's face it, they're carrying a pretty good burden as well. We're talking with William Dunstan. He is a Young Voices contributor. And William, for those who wish to follow you on social media, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
The best way is on X, formerly known as Twitter. That's where I'm most active in the public sphere and in public debates about public policy, both in Canada and in the U.S. So definitely follow me there.
All right. Great to visit with you. I expect we'll have a lot to talk about in future episodes. Looking forward to our next conversation.
Thanks for having me on.
And we are back on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Lora Karch to the program. She is a Young Voices contributor. And Lora, I'm anxious to get to know a little bit about you as well. This is your first time on Moving Forward. Tell us about who you are and about what you do.
Hi, Bryan. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. So I work at a local think tank here in DC, and my background is basically in international relations with a concentration on Eurasia and the Middle East, national security, and I have a master's in diplomacy as well. So I am an Assyrian and an independent thinker and writer, and I'm just passionate about diplomacy and basically safeguarding these ancient civilizations.
Boy, if you are studying, international relations too, you've got a lot to keep track of. Let's talk about the I don't even know what to call it, the proposed purchase or the proposed adoption, if we could call it that, of Greenland by the United States. When that idea first came up, I just shook my head and went, why would we want Greenland? And after hearing a few people explain, well, there's a lot of good stuff happening in Greenland. Maybe it's not such a bad idea, but I'd like to get your take on why the interest in Greenland. Could it be a good thing, or is this an unnecessary expansion? What is your take?
So I see it as potentially mutually beneficial for both, the U.S. and the Greenlanders. But it's important to note in the beginning that the interest actually did not begin with President Trump. Our first, not official offer, but our first talks about acquiring Greenland actually started in 1867 with William Seward, who then bought Alaska and I guess tried his hand at Greenland as well, in which, of course, Denmark refused at the time. And the next time after that was slightly after World War II with President Truman, who offered an official $100 million in gold, which would total to about $1.6 billion today if we're accounting for inflation. So it's not the first time, but I would say the main reasons for interest would be that, Greenland, it's a giant island covered in 80% of ice, over its landmass. But under the ice is what's important. So there's a bunch of natural resource deposits. The island itself is placed in a very geostrategic position in regards to the U.S., Russia, and China, as we may have heard. And it has huge potential to become a future trade hub, likely more valuable than the Panama Canal, we can argue. So lots to unpack there.
Yeah, I mean, I have flown over Greenland a time or two on my way to or from Europe, but really I looked down and went, there's so much ice. And I'm wondering how many people actually live there. So aside from me wondering as I'm flying over, what is the population of Greenland at this time?
About 57,000 to date, so not very many.
Okay, it's a very small country population-wise, but those resources, I'm curious, what are the primary drivers of the economy for those who live in Greenland?
So economy is basically set up in an interesting way. Greenland is technically a county of Denmark still, and they are very reliant, basically funded by Denmark by an annual grant called the Bloktilskud, and that basically provides money for their fishing sectors. The largest sector would be the public service, so government jobs. We have, they have the whaling, they have hunting, and that's what basically makes up their economy at the moment. The problem with that is that they are a little too reliant on Denmark, and recently they've actually been voicing more and more want for independence. Given the recent polls, we've had 85% Greenlanders, of course, opposing becoming part of the United States, but 2/3 of them still want independence from Denmark. So it's a very sticky situation at the moment.
Now, I have to ask you this too, Lora. China and Russia, what is their interest in Greenland? I can't imagine. If there are vast natural resources there, I'm sure that would capture their attention as well.
Yes. So I'll begin with China. China actually had previous interest and past attempts to rebuild an abandoned airport, invest in their mining sector. But of course, those deals were blocked by the U.S. in the past, who also pressured Denmark to make the funding for those, which they did. I would say the main interest for China would be the natural resources. There was the proposed, sorry if I get this wrong, the Bongerfield rare earth project, in which a Chinese company invested in a mining in Greenland, in Southwest Greenland. And it was basically for coal and iron. And, on top of that, they wanted to build what they called the Silk Road project in order to connect the villages and the mines together so that they can extract quicker and more efficiently. And of course, the U.S. and the West sees this as, a threat, given that the FBI did recently deem China, or the Chinese Communist Party, as a threat to U.S. and the West democracy. So
interesting. And now, did you mention Russia as well? Do they have
yes.
designs?
So Russia has recently remilitarized its Arctic. Specifically, notably in its Far East, there's been they actually have the world's largest floating nuclear plant in the Far East of Russia, just west of Alaska and Greenland, which is, of course, one of our biggest fears right now. But their official purpose for this plant would be to, give electricity, heat to that region, and resource extraction as well. So I think the reopening of these Soviet-era bases in the Arctic and Russia is something that we should, or something that I think the U.S. is looking closely at. And, their interest, Russia's interest, is probably the geostrategic military interest that the U.S. is approaching the purchase from.
Talk to me about what this would mean in terms of shipping traffic, because I guess I've kind of labored under the idea that, well, everything's frozen up there up north, but actually it looks like there are some very viable shipping passages that
yes,
go around there.
Yes, actually, there are three key passages. One of them being the Northwest Passage, which global melting is melting more ice in its path, so it's becoming way more, quicker. And this passage connects Asia and Europe and reduces shipping by at least 2 weeks in compared to the Panama Canal. So future control over the Northwest Passage would mean that the U.S. would theoretically be able to control the traffic with the entrance and exits of this passage, which can be seen as problematic, of course. We do also have, or Greenland also has, the Northern Sea Route, which is also expected to see a lot more traffic in the next 10 years. And the third Transpolar Sea Route, which is now basically frozen over, but again, it's a waiting game with global warming. It runs directly through the center of the North Pole. And scientists are saying that by 2050, it can become more viable for use. So Greenland is running in the running to become more strategically valuable than the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal at this point.
We've got about 1 minute left here, Lora, but I have to ask, short of being purchased by the Trump administration, for the benefit of the U.S., are there other alternatives that could be undertaken?
So I believe that this is a great opportunity for the Greenlanders to really settle into their leverage. Of course, we see the geostrategic, we see the military, we see their natural resources. They have a ton of opportunity there to invite foreign investment into the new infrastructure. Now, one thing to note is that they do have an upcoming election on March 11th, where one of their main parties, the Sumu Party, the party that believes in self-determination, basically, has called to have another referendum on their independence. So if the Greenlanders successfully declare independence from Denmark, they would be able to invite more foreign investment to hopefully build more infrastructure that would enhance their education, healthcare, diplomacy sectors, military, so that they can become more of a real player in Arctic politics.
Again, we're talking with Lora Karch. Lora, where can people find you on social media?
Right now, I'm on X at Lora Karch.
And we are back. This is our fourth and final segment today on Moving Forward with Young Voices. I'm happy to welcome Farrell Gregory. He is a contributor to Young Voices. And Farrell, since this is your first time on the program, take a moment. Tell me a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So currently I'm studying at Mansfield College over in England. I'm currently a research assistant at Yorktown Institute and editor of the Emerging Threats Journal here at Oxford.
All right. I'm looking at the title of an article that you've written. The U.S. shouldn't have to stop Britain's disastrous Chagos deal. I don't even know if I'm saying that name correctly. Chagos?
Yes.
Okay. Can you fill me in as someone who is completely unaware of what the Chagos deal is? What do I need to know about that?
Well, first I'll say that everything I've learned about this deal has been against my will. It's been popping up through the British press, and by proximity, I've learned about it. So the Chagos Islands are some islands that Britain administers in the Indian Ocean, has done so for several hundred years, and they've only become notable recently because the British government signed a deal with Mauritius to transfer sovereignty of the islands to the government of Mauritius. If you don't know where Mauritius is, it's another small island nation in the Indian Ocean, much closer to Africa, however. One point to note is that Mauritius and the Chagos Islands are about 1,300 miles apart, which strains a bit the credulity of transferring sovereignty. And that's just the least of it. The UK and the US have a joint military base on the Chagos Islands called Diego Garcia. And ultimately, transferring sovereignty to Mauritius would represent a serious national security threat to the United States. So, already it's a bad idea for Britain to be doing this. And as I argue in my piece, not only should Britain not do it, the United States shouldn't have to step in and stop them from doing it in the first place.
So where did the impetus come from to make this transfer of sovereignty? I mean, whose idea was it?
So most recently, the claimed cause is that in 2019, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion stating that the United Kingdom should end its administration over the Chagos Islands. Now, it's important to note that an advisory opinion is non-binding. The law is not compelling. There's no ICJ ruling that Britain must do this. It's simply an advisory opinion from the ICJ. And yet, the current British government has taken that as a justification for entering into and completing negotiations with the Mauritian government and saying that this is the only way to secure the future of the base is by complying with international law and transferring sovereignty over to the Mauritians.
Interesting. Now, I know Diego Garcia has been a strategic base for quite some time. In fact, when we talked about the Chagos Islands, I had no idea. When you said Diego Garcia, I had a rough idea because I kind of know the part of the world that's in. But talk to me about strategically, what is the benefit of having a base on that island?
Sure. So if you take out a map and look at the Chagos Islands, they are really right dead in the center of the Indian Ocean. It's an important naval and air base for us in that region in the Indo-Pacific. It's really one of the two major bombing bases that we have in the region, alongside a base in Guam. And it's also a base that we've been able to close off very securely from outside influence because the UK and the US have been able to establish a perimeter, a naval perimeter around the base that affords it a level of protection that other bases may not have. Now, if sovereignty is transferred to Mauritius and this base is only leased, it's possible that that kind of heightened secrecy, heightened protection might be threatened.
And does China have deep interest in these islands for themselves?
China has interest in everything these days. It's interesting. Mauritius was the first African country to sign a free trade agreement with China in 2019. There are concerns about the degree to which they rely on Huawei technology, and you can't say anything for certain. But China is certainly a topic of interest when it comes to Diego Garcia.
Interesting. What about the people who populate either Mauritius or or the Chagos Islands. Do they want a say in the matter? There's a part of me wondering if maybe there's some independence-minded folks among them, or are they content, to be kind of a protectorate?
That's a complicated matter. I'll just dive into the history really quickly. The only reason that there is, a grouping between these two islands that are, again, 1,300 miles apart is because once Britain took administration over Mauritius and the Chagos Islands, it was because they'd taken them from the French in 1814. And from there until 1965, they were kind of administered together. In 1965, they become the same administered British Indian Ocean Territory. In 1968, Mauritius gets its independence. There's an issue with Britain expelling people who are living on the Chagos Islands. They've largely gone either some to Mauritius, some to the Seychelles, many to Britain. So it's a complicated issue. But the most important fact to remember there is that the only reason that Mauritius and Chagos really have any kind of connection, again, given their distance, is because of the colonial administration, because they were grouped together, hundreds of years ago.
Interesting. And so it almost sounds like it's, hey, this has been in place for so long, it's just habit, and we don't really want to give it up.
Sure. Part of it is that since 1968, Mauritius has had independence. They haven't really had much to do with the Chagos Islands. I think it's no coincidence that, Mauritius has come around and has succeeded in its, admittedly long-standing effort to get control of the Chagos Islands right now in Britain. I think, there's a particular openness in the current British government. And I'd say there's also a certain weakness that the Mauritians are exploiting.
You mentioned in your article, in fact, you asked the question, why would Britain give Chagos to Mauritius and pay 90 million pounds every year for the privilege of doing so? And that's kind of what occurs to me too. What is in this for the British people? What benefit do they see?
Well, I'll tell you from having talked to the British people, they don't have a clear answer on that either. Yes. So as you said, $90 million a year, that would be the leasing cost for the Diego Garcia base. Ultimately, Britain would end up paying about 18 billion pounds, which is, quite a bit. And, you have to ask, why would they do this? If you ask somebody in the government, they'd probably give you two reasons. First, they'd say international law compels them. I would argue that it doesn't. There would also be those, particularly the Foreign Secretary David Lammy, who say that this is an essential thing to do to improve Britain's standing abroad, especially among developing countries. He's a big proponent of soft power. I question how threatening the security of a very important military base is, a replacement for the possibility of some improved PR. But this does bring me, in my head to, I'm sure you saw, Vice President Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference. And he said something that I thought really spoke to this. He said that the threat that I worry about most vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia or China. It's not any external actor. He said that what he worries most about was the threat from within. And as I stated in my piece, the biggest threat to the continuity of the Diego Garcia base is not China. It's not Mauritius. The only reason that this base is in question is because of Britain. Now, historically, the US and the UK have a special relationship because of our history and because our values align. And I believe the U.S. is still interested in protecting Britain's sovereignty. The question is why the British government has decided to change their values and is no longer interested in protecting their own sovereignty.
Well, I'll tell you what, you have opened my eyes to an issue that otherwise would have flown completely under my radar, but now my ears are going to perk up every time I hear about the Chagos Islands or Mauritius, or for that matter, what the Brits and Americans and everybody else is doing on the far side of the world. Again, we're talking with Farrell Gregory. Farrell, for those who wish to follow your work or would like to connect with you on social media, what's the best way to go about that?
Best way to do that would probably be X. My handle is at EFARRELL Gregory, Farrell Gregory.
Well, and listen, I really appreciate you digging into this issue because, as you mentioned at the beginning of this segment, it wasn't exactly like you chose to do this. You kind of were required to, but man, you did a great job. And thanks for your hard work.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.